Since the Entity API is object-oriented, we'll have to get familiar with a few basic classes in order to understand it. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the base entity class that provides a few properties about our entity. We'll also take a look at the controller, which provides some support for creating new entities, reading them from the database, updating them, deleting them, tracking revisions, and similar operations. We'll also take a look at what's provided by the Entity API contrib module and the default classes, so you'll know where the behavior you need to override is when it comes time to implement that in your custom entity. Now that we have our basic implementation of hook entity info and our custom entity is loading correctly, let's take a little more detailed look at what Entity API is providing us, especially the Entity contrib module. In core, the only entity helper function that's provided is entity load. The other operations around creating, reading, updating, and deleting entities don't have similar helper functions in Drupal 7. That's where the Entity API contrib module comes in. It provides several helper functions like entity save, entity delete multiple, entity revision load, and other functions that Drupal 7 core doesn't quite provide by itself. You can take a look at entity.module that comes with the contrib module to see a list of a lot of these helper functions. But to really understand how the Entity API is working, we need to understand a little bit more about object-oriented programming and the idea of controllers. Going back to our hook entity info implementation, there are a few properties we can add to the array to make some of the relationships between the entity class, the entity controller class, and the admin UI entity class a little bit more obvious. The default entity class is the class entity. This can be found in the contrib module in the includes directory as entity.inc. Taking a look at this base class, you'll see that there are a few helper methods that do things like set up your entity so that we have the name and the ID available, keep track of the entity info information that's provided by hook entity info for this custom entity, the entity type, which bundle it's a part of, its label, the URI for locating this entity, the default path you can find it at, and then other helper functions that make things like entity save possible. This is necessary because it's a contrib module. You can see that the save method in the entity class is actually calling entity get controller and using its save method. We'll take a look at that in a minute, but it's functions like this in the base class that make entity save work outside of Drupal core. The next class we need to take a look at and implement for our custom entity is the controller class. The controller class is responsible for things like creating, reading, updating, and deleting our custom entity, as well as tracking things like the current revision and saving new revisions, and exportability, which we'll take a look at in future lessons. The default controller class that comes with Drupal core is Drupal default entity controller. The Entity API contrib module provides a couple of other controllers that are a little bit more fully featured. The first one of these is Entity API controller, and the second is Entity API controller exportable. The latter providing extra exportability if our entity isn't content-based and relies more on configuration. In our case, we'll extend one of these base classes and create our own custom class, Video Entity Controller. We'll need to do this so that we can override the default URI method and provide a path that we can view our custom entity at. Before we do that though, let's dig in and take a look at what the default controller provides. In the Entity contrib module, includes folder, there's a file entity.controller.inc. If we take a look past the interface definitions in this file, we can see that the Entity API controller extends the Drupal default entity controller. Scrolling through, you can see methods for building the query, so we know how to query for our custom entity, load methods for loading our entity, a delete method for taking care of deleting our entity, a delete revision method if our entity supports revisioning, a save method, save revision, create, export, import, build content, which is used for rendering, view, which is used for actually viewing the entity and its output on a page. So now that we know what this controller looks like, let's go ahead and implement it down at the bottom of our custom entity file here. For now, we don't actually need to override any of the methods in the controller. Everything in the default is fine. But in a future lesson, when we want to override how the content is built and viewed, we'll find this stub handy. One piece we do want to add if we want to be able to view our custom entity on a page is the default URI implementation. If we go back and take a look at our entity class, we'll see that the default URI uses a path of default/identifier for a custom entity. Since we're going to be serving up videos with our entity, let's change this path so it's video/ID instead. To do that, we'll need to override the entity class in our module. Again, near the bottom of our file, let's go ahead and implement our own video entity class. This is going to extend the entity class that comes with the contrib module so that we can override the default URI method. Switching back to that entity class, we can copy and paste this default URI method from the entity class to our video entity class so that it can be overridden. And we'll change the URL from default/ to video/. This will make it so that the default URI for any of our custom entities is video/ID rather than default/ID. There's one more piece we need to make this work. Back up in our hook entity info implementation, we need to let entity API know what it should use for the URI callback. So let's go ahead and add that as well. In this case, we'll use the default function that comes with entity API, entity class URI. Using this function, we'll actually take a look at our entity class, in this case video entity, and run the default URI method to retrieve the URI that we should use for rendering this entity. Now that we have that in place, let's return to our hook menu implementation and create a page for rendering one of our custom video entities. In this case, let's register the path video/ID. When a user on the website visits one of these paths, one of our custom video entities will be loaded. We'll include some code that auto-loads our entity based on the path, and then we'll drop in the actual page callback itself. So when a user visits video/ID, we'll have a loaded video passed to the entity page. We'll run it through entity view, and then we'll use Crumo to output the video entity. Let's take a look at what that looks like on the website. Visiting the URL video/1 on our local site, we now see the Crumo output from loading our entity by ID. There's one more controller class we could take a look at that's provided by Entity API, and that's the UI controller. Here's some skeleton code to implement the video entity UI controller, which extends entity default UI controller. This will provide a basic admin skeleton interface, allowing us to interact with our video entities. We'll take a more in-depth look at this controller in the next lesson. In summary, the Entity API works with three main classes. The entity class provides some metadata information, including information that's provided in hook entity info for the various entity types, as well as some helper functions that make things like entity_save and entity_delete work correctly, because this exists as a contrib module. The entity controller provides other helper methods that track things like saving new revisions, updating existing entities, loading them from the database, resetting the cache, and similar. Whereas the UI controller provides methods that revolve around showing listings of the entities on admin pages, generating their edit forms, and being able to interact with the entity from the administration interface. Taking a look at the default controllers provided by Entity API will give you an idea of the methods that can be overridden so that you can customize your entity as needed.